So before we do anything else today, I want to remind everybody that the paper one proposals are due tonight, right? So I've seen drafts from a couple of you. Good start. Keep it up. One thing I do want to note, right, is that the proposal is just a presentation of your idea, right? So don't sweat it too much. You'll get full credit as long as you turn it in and it's long enough. The better your proposal is, right, the stronger your paper is likely to be. So, I mean, really, what it is it's a chance for me to give you some feedback before you commit too deeply to a paper topic. So, does anybody have any questions about the paper or about the proposal? Okay, so I will email you this afternoon a list of the 25 or so vocab terms you should know for the exam. I just didn't get around to getting one of those printed out before class today. Yeah, you'll get that from me this afternoon. So does anybody have any questions about the exam? Okay, and I will not be here to administer the exam. I'm going to have to get one of my colleagues to come in and fill in for me because jury duty, yay, can't wait. I should be, from what I understand, from what I've heard, like my friend in the VA's office has told me, this shouldn't take me more than a day, so I should be back on Wednesday.
Is it Wednesday or next week?
What's that?
The test, is it Wednesday or next week?
It's next month. It's a week from today.
Okay.
A week from today is the exam. Now, for Wednesday, you're going to be switching to volume E, and you're going to be reading the excerpt from Thomas Carlyle's Sartor Resartus. And I'm just going to warn you ahead of time, give yourself plenty of time with this, and maybe go over difficult parts of it more than once because it's going to be hard, and it might not initially make a lot of sense to you. So make sure you read the introductory materials, track the guide questions that I give you, and yeah, maybe make time to read it more than once because it's probably going to confuse you. All right, so if there are no questions about anything that's coming up, let's just quickly run through the vocab terms from this weekend's quiz, and then we'll get into today's material. All right, Cornelius Agrippa. Who or what is Cornelius Agrippa?
He's the alchemist.
Mm-hmm. Yep, he is. Yep, he's the alchemist. In the Mortal Immortal.
The Mortal.
Okay.
And it's based off of a real person in
Yep.
some ways.
Yep. He, in fact, yeah, Cornelius Agrippa was a real person. And what else is important about, like, apart from the fact that he's an alchemist in that particular story? So he's an alchemist in The Mortal Immortal by Mary Shelley, based on a real person. What else about him is important? What does he do?
In the story, or
Yes, in the story.
he makes the potion that Lindsay.
Yes, he creates the elixir of life, right? All right, good. The beadsman. Who was the beadsman? Anybody? Oh, go ahead.
He would be hired to pray for other sins.
Yeah, the beadsman is someone who is hired to pray for other people's sins and to live a life of self-denial, right? In order, again, to help other people attain salvation, right? And what text does the beadsman appear in?
St. Agnes Eve.
Yes, John Keats, The Eve of St. Agnes, right? All right, good. Negative capability. What is negative capability?
It's the capability of not do something.
Yes, specifically the capability to hold yourself back from trying to reach conclusions too quickly, right? So when we talk about negative capability right now, Keats, describes it as like, that ability to remain in uncertainties, right? Without any irritable reaching after fact and reason, right? So if someone who has a negative capability is someone who doesn't force closure too quickly. And then if it's Keats, then what text is it most closely related to? Eve St. Agnes, right? Good. All right. Literary annual. What are literary annuals? At least in the context of this class.
Like gift books?
Okay, yeah, the gift books, right? Can you elaborate a little bit? Anything else to remember about literary annuals?
They were more for decoration and not for like reading for middle class women.
Yeah, they're expensively bound and richly illustrated, right? Audience of middle class women. And yeah, usually published in the autumn and tended to be given as Christmas gifts, right? All right, Madeline. Who is Madeline? Anybody remember Madeline?
She was the daughter of the Lord of the castle and participated in the ritual, so she could have a dream of her future love.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, she is, that's going to be the object of Porphyro's affection, right?
Mm-hmm.
That he spies on from the closet in the Eve of St. Agnes. All right. Related to this, then, the male gaze.
The reading is portrayed through the way the male sees the female.
Yeah, it's the tendency in art, whether visual or literary, right, to present the female form, the female body, as something for like male consumption, right? Like it's the way texts tend to assume a heterosexual male reader or viewer who is essentially going to be turned on by the female figure, right? All right, good. Byronic hero. What's a Byronic hero? The male gaze, again, by the way, is most relevant to the Eve of St. Agnes, right now, where Porphyro is staring at Madeline from the closet. All right, Byronic hero. What's a Byronic hero?
It was named after Laudanum, and it
Okay.
was
Yep.
it was a male character who was an overreacher, and he didn't stick in society.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's like, unlike the male Gothic figure, the male Gothic overreacher, who the Byronic hero is descended from, the Byronic hero doesn't necessarily go around trying to break social conventions or overstep them. What he does is more just kind of try to stand outside of them. And, you know, so Byronic heroes will usually spend a lot of time going around brooding and, you know, staring at sublime landscapes and well deep in thought and things like that. So this is kind of like, whimsy becomes a kind of ironic parody of this out of necessity at the end of the Middle World, right? You're also going to want to remember this archetype, keep this in mind for Sartor Resartus. Because I think that some of the perspective character's behavior will make a lot more sense to you if you think about it in these terms. Okay, Bertha.
She was who Wendy was in love with.
Yes.
And he kind of like strung him along a little bit, didn't really want him to, he didn't want her.
Mm-hmm. And then eventually his wife, right? And he remains young while she continues to age, right? So she becomes this kind of burden of duty to him rather than, you know, a person he still loves. And all of this, right? Mary Shelley even more. All right, Porphyro, right? So we've made some references here to Porphyro already. So does everybody remember who Porphyro was?
The enemy of Madeline's family?
Yeah, he's the enemy of Madeline's family, right? And he's the guy who's hiding in the closet while she's supposed to be dreaming of her future husband, right? He sneaks into the castle in order to kind of to lure her away with him, right? And finally, Luigi Belvani.
He's the one that did like experiments on the frogs.
Yes, exactly. If he's an Italian kind of showman scientist who went around with an electrode and a pair of severed frog's legs and would send a jolt through the legs to make them jump, right? So did genuine scientific, made a genuine scientific discovery, right, that our nerve impulses are electrical, but did so in a way that was kind of particularly dramatic for an audience to watch, right? And Mary Shelley had seen Belvani's presentation as a child, and this kind of sticks with her in texts like the Middle of the War. Okay, any questions about any of the vocab stuff? And I know that like this is not, going over these at the beginning of every Monday class is not the most exciting thing in the world, but I do think it'll help to reinforce some of this stuff for the exam to help you remember it when we talk about similar concepts later on. All right. So, what did you think of the readings that I gave you for today? How'd these go for you?
To read over the one by Robert Southey twice.
Okay.
Because some of the stuff I was like,
Okay. And I think like, so what Southey is describing here, second or third or fourth hand, is a Hindu religious ceremony. It's a regional thing. Like, it's not celebrated throughout India. It's mostly in kind of like northeast India and parts of Bangladesh. But yeah, so he's got this figure, Juggernaut. How many of you have ever heard the term juggernaut before? Does this sound familiar? Do you know what a juggernaut is? Okay, so you've heard it, but you know that it's okay. So a juggernaut is essentially this kind of like gigantic, moving, rolling structure that just crushes everything in its path, right? In fact, I think there's a Marvel supervillain called the Juggernaut, who's just this kind of huge dude who runs over people. So Jaggernaught and Juggernaut are both like mistransliterations of the name of the Hindu deity who is celebrated in these festivals, which is actually Jagannath. And Jagannath is an aspect of the god Vishnu, who is considered like the preserver of the world as it is, right? So the three main Hindu deities are all kind of, they're all kind of faces of the same being, but they have different, they're faces of the same being performing different actions, basically, right? So Brahma is the creator, Vishnu is the preserver, right? Protects the world as it is, and Shiva is the destroyer who, clears the way for new creation, right? So Jagannath is an aspect of Vishnu. And what kind of impression do you get of Jagannath from this poem? What does the god here look like? What's the kind of behavior of the worshipers like? What's going on here? The festival being described here, by the way, is called Rathyatra, which translates to Festival of the Chariot. So what's actually going on here in this poem? It's an excerpt from a longer poem, which might be part of why it was confusing. It's taken out of context. But yeah, what does the god look like? What actions are being taken here by the god or his worshippers?
There's a bride, but I couldn't tell if they were getting. Obviously, she's a bride, but I couldn't tell if they were getting married or not. Like it just kind of seemed like, oh, here she is, and then.
Okay, yeah, so there's this reference to a bride, right, who was riding on the god's chariot, right? So could any of you figure out what was going on with the bride here? Who has this bride been married to, do you think? Let's look at the second stanza here, right? Now bring ye forth the chariot of the god, bring him abroad, that through the swarming city he may ride, and by his side place ye the maid of more than mortal grace, the maid of perfect form and heavenly face. Does this help at all? Thinking about who the bride is being married to? Yeah, exactly.
The seven-headed god.
Yeah. We'll put the seven heads thing aside for a minute. One thing to note about the whole seven-headed thing is that it's proof that Sati himself never actually witnessed this particular festival, right? Because Jagannath does not have seven heads; he's only got one. He's a painted block of wood he's a block of wood with a face painted on. That's essentially what he looks like. So we've got a bride who's been married to a god, right? So it's this kind of like, it's presented as this divine marriage kind of ceremony, right? And then what else is going on as the ceremony proceeds? How is the chariot moving? How is the god's chariot moving?
It sounds like violent.
Okay, what makes it sound violent?
Where it says the car rolls in and crushes all through blood and bones. The clouds obstruct the path.
Uh-huh.
So it's not coming in smooth and nice.
Okay, yeah, not so much. Yeah, not so smooth, not so nice. And like the people that it's crushing, does it seem to be crushing them accidentally? No, yeah, they're described as throwing their bodies in the path of the chariot to be crushed, right? So what Southey is depicting here is a pretty famous and kind of widely held misconception about this particular Hindu ceremony that is couched in the language and imagery of Gothic horror, right? We have the innocent maiden who is sitting atop the god's chariot, watching in horror while these other people throw themselves in front of it, right? So she's, helpless to do anything. She's a prisoner of, these priests and of this god as it violently rolls over the bodies of the devoted, right? So these misconceptions, for one thing about the seven-headed god, come primarily from unreliable sources from the Middle Ages through the 18th century, right? So the whole thing about the crushing people comes from a book called The Travels of John Mandeville. That was extremely popular throughout Europe in the 14th century. Now, the thing about the Travels of Mandeville, right, there were a number of authentic travel narratives that were also popular in Europe in the Middle Ages. There's the Travels of Marco Polo, for example, who actually went to the places that he described, even if he sometimes got things wrong or misinterpreted, misunderstood things. Mandeville, we don't actually know who Mandeville was. And most of the things that he says in his travels are completely fanciful, right? He just makes shit up, which suggests that he didn't go to most of the places that he had to, really probably to any of the places he described, and was at best relying on like third or fourth hand information when he wasn't just making things up. So the stories of the intentional crushing, right, come from an unreliable source. As does the whole idea of the seven-headed god. This comes from the memoirs of a British traveler named William Burton, who wrote this in 1633. And what Burton was probably trying to do was associate this Hindu deity with the beast of the great beast of Revelation. Right. This kind of, so he presents Jagannath as this kind of multi-headed serpent being, right? That people sacrifice themselves to. So let me just take a minute here, and I'll just show you a few minutes of what this Rathyatra ceremony actually looks like. There we go.
Impressive floats, surrounded by even more impressive crowds. For 9 days each year in late June and early July, 1 million people gather in Puri, one of India's 4 most sacred Hindu pilgrimage sites.
That's
The gods
the
worshipped
Jagannath.
here make their appearance in spectacular fashion. This time on Festivals of the Orient, India's Rathyatra, a festival featuring the largest temple cars in the world. 1,300 kilometers southeast of New Delhi is the city of Puri in Orissa state.
Okay, I think we probably got the idea of what this looks like from there, right? Certainly, no one being crushed on purpose, right? No one throwing themselves under chariot wheels, and no seven-headed anything, right? So, what I want to try to talk about here a little bit is the circumstances that would lead a poet like Southey to invent these kinds of details, or promote these kinds of details when talking about an Indian religious ceremony, right? So, have any of you ever heard the term Orientalism before? Have I used it in this class? Okay, good. Because I went through my notes to see if we'd gone over this, and I didn't think we had, but okay. So those of you who nodded, do you know what Orientalism refers to?
I don't know.
Okay. It's okay, we'll remind you. So Orientalism, in the context we're going to be using, it actually kind of refers to 2 things, right? So the first is a field of study that was popularized particularly in Europe in the 18th and 19th centuries. And European Orientalists studied the languages, history, and cultures of Asia, kind of stretching from the Eastern Mediterranean out to Japan, right? So this is meaning number 1 of Orientalism, right? It's an academic field. The second meaning has to do with Western depictions of Asia in visual art and in literature. And these are often in some way dependent on this first definition, right? The work of these academics who are studying Asia. But it often also goes in completely fanciful directions, right? And it kind of tends to force Asian ideas and traditions into Western molds. So, for example, we can see both in the Robert Southey poem and in the Claudius Buchanan piece that accompanies it, the influence of the Gothic, right? So the way Orientalism, and the big scholar for this, I put him on the bibliography here for you, Edward Said. Said defines this as a kind of projection, right? So what Westerners will do in producing Orientalist art is kind of, in order to make the East quote unquote exotic, they will project onto it characteristics they don't want to see in themselves or in the West, right? So if the Westerner sees himself as chaste, he'll paint the Easterner as promiscuous, right? If he sees himself as industrious, he'll paint the Easterner as lazy. If he sees himself as practical, he'll paint the Easterner as dreamy, right? A rational Westerner will paint the East as irrational, and this is the really probably most important thing that happens here is that Westerners kind of like paint the West, Europe in particular, as the natural seat of democracy. And they associate the East thus with tyranny, right? That the natural state of Asian government is authoritarianism or despotism, right? Which we can actually, we know from, we can know from doing a historical survey isn't actually true. In either case here, right? Neither the West is not naturally democratic, and the East is not naturally despotic, right? But this is connected to a larger idea that Europeans have about themselves, right? That Europe is future-oriented and progressive, while Asia is mired in the past. Right, there's a tendency among Orientalist scholars and artists to depict Asia as being kind of like a less advanced state than Europe, right? That it's a place where, history at some point seemed to them to have stopped. And all of this is accompanied by intense colonization, commercial, and missionary activity. So, the East India Company, who I'm pretty sure we have mentioned, and even if we haven't, right, the East India Company you should know as the company that owned the ships in Boston Harbor that the Sons of Liberty stormed and threw all the tea into the harbor, right? So the East India Company was founded in 1600 to control trade, particularly around the Indian Ocean. And just as when we looked at that Atlantic trade triangle, right, they would take manufactured goods from Britain to Africa to trade for gold, spices, and slaves, and take that to the Americas to trade for rum, molasses, sugar, and then take that back to Britain, right? There were particular commodities in South Asia and East Asia that the East India Company wanted, right? So what they were trading for mostly were tea, spices, indigo for making dyes, and opium. Right, which in the 18th and 19th centuries was not a controlled substance, it was not illegal. It was a widely prescribed painkiller. In fact, probably the most widely prescribed drug in the 19th century was called laudanum. Does anybody know what laudanum was? So laudanum was a tincture that you made by dissolving opium in alcohol. And it was in particular prescribed as a treatment for rheumatism. So a lot of writers and artists who you read about from the 19th century who were addicted to opium, that's how they got there. They probably prescribed laudanum for some kind of aches and pains, and eventually got hooked on the stuff. But yeah, that's one of the things the East India Company was trading for. And they were the de facto rulers of most of India for about 100 years, from 1757 to 1858, when a native mutiny ended their rule of the region. And this single company, at their height, controlled fully half of the world's trade. So they're enormously powerful, enormously rich, and enormously influential. And they move not just European goods, but European people into India. So initially, what you're getting are merchants and clerks and soldiers and other kinds of security personnel. Now, these merchants and clerks are then eventually followed by missionaries, artists, and tourists. And some of the people who come to Asia following in the wake of the East India Company fit two or more of these descriptors, right? So, for example, Thomas and William Daniel, who wrote the first piece that you read for today, they're artists, they're painters, but they're also coming as tourists. And one thing that we can see in the work of some of these artist tourists is like art as a means of defining and controlling a place. So if we go to the Daniels piece, yeah, go ahead,
Sorry,
Jordan.
quick question. It
Yeah.
says employees plus what, sorry?
Oh, employees and hangers-on.
Thank you.
If we go to the Thomas Daniel piece on 933, can somebody just read out the title of that for me?
From a picturesque voyage to India by the boat.
Any words that, in that title look familiar or jump out to you?
Picturesque.
Picturesque, yes, good. You should remember that one. And what does picturesque mean? What is the picturesque?
I want to say the sublime framed to show something, to show the beauty and to not see it in a scary way.
Yeah, it's a way of framing and taming the sublime, right? So that you can experience that, the awe and the grandeur, without the sense of fear that goes along with it, right? And I think that, like, yeah, this sense of framing and taming in particular is relevant to what the Daniels are doing in their artistic depictions of India. So I'm going to show you a few images of watercolors that the Daniels painted while they were in India, while they were traveling. And I want you to just kind of pick out for me any kind of like common elements that you see. So let's start with this one. And gotta be better to do this. So what does this look like? Where is this? What kind of location is this? What kind of place is this? And how can we tell?
It almost looks like some sort of like worship place. Because they have the animals at the top and the people at the bottom.
Yeah, what else makes this look like a temple? Yeah, you're absolutely right. Yeah, this is a temple.
Well, the one person who looks like he's praying.
Yeah, this is somebody who's praying and leaving an offering here, right? We've got these statues of what appear to be gods, right? And how do the human figures in the image compare to the location itself, like in terms of scale or size? Yeah, the people are really tiny and the building's really big, right? So giving you that sense of the sublime. And we'll talk in a minute maybe about what else is going on in the way people are depicted here.
What is the, on the ceiling, is it someone doing the, I don't know, I call it the pose, where like their legs are crossed and they're meditating? Is that what they're doing?
Yeah, well, you mean like this image up here? Yeah, it looks like probably a yogi or an ascetic of some kind, like doing the lotus position. All right, so let's look at another one here. So what do we know? What do we notice here?
Is it like built into the mountain?
Yeah, we've got we've got this temple or the structure, right, that is carved directly into the mountain. Good. What's similar here?
The size.
Okay, yeah, the size, the scale, right? Yeah. Again, we've got tiny little people and enormous structure. What's different here? Between this and the other one?
Any statues of gods?
Yeah, there are these kind of like relief carvings on the building. If there aren't these statues of gods here, right? What else is present in this picture that is missing in the other picture? What's that?
Nature.
Yeah, there's all this greenery all over the place, right? There's grass and moss growing on these rocks. There are, trees kind of poking in here, right? There's all this kind of like overhanging green stuff. So does this look to us like a new building that is in use, or does it look like a ruin? Yeah, this looks like a ruin, right? Now, it's actually not a ruin. This was actually a temple that was in use, right? But now here we've got kind of one of the most famous locations in India. Does everybody recognize this building? Okay, yeah, this is the Taj Mahal, right? What do we see here? Okay, yeah. Greenery all over the place, right? Although this looks a little bit more tamed and cultivated than in the other example, right? We've got a fountain here in the middle. It's more like a park or a garden. Tiny little people once again. And then one more that I want to show you here. So here we have a gate, right? Supposed to be leading into a city, but what seems to be missing?
Okay.
Well, here's the gate, right?
Oh.
But then, if it's supposed to be a gate into a city, what would we expect to see behind it?
The city.
Yeah. The city seems to be curiously absent. And instead we have like this kind of riot of greenery again all over the place, right? So what kind of overall impression of India is this giving us? And again, like, try to think about this in terms of these kind of Orientalist ideas, these Orientalist tropes that we've been talking about. What are some of the overall impressions of India that these pictures give?
It's almost an ancient culture, and they're still living in the past.
Yeah, that this is, this is an ancient and unchanged culture, right? That, these are just old buildings that trees have just kind of grown over, right? Nothing in these pictures looks remotely like a European city, right? Nothing here looks modern, at least, to a European eye. I think it might help if we turn to what Thomas Daniel thought he was doing with these pictures, right? What his intention was. If we look on page 933. By the way, these images as well were intended for essentially like a coffee table book, right? So something not unlike the literary annuals that we were talking about last time. So can I get somebody to start reading for us this first paragraph here that begins with "From the earliest era of history."
From the earliest era of history, the attention of Europe has been drawn to the east, whose fastidious people, mainly the slaving kindred with other families of mankind, have been implicated in the fate of distant nations and compelled to endure their unwelcome alliance, or to enhance their suspicious friendship. By a series of political changes in other quarters of the globe, these countries have been rendered subservient to the feeling or policy of Europe. Curiosity has penetrated the veil of mystery that so long enveloped their civil and religious systems, and their pompous pretensions to antiquity, their venerable laws and institutions are now exposed to the sacrilegious scrutiny of strangers.
Okay, cool. Thank you. So, can you pick out any kind of like key terms or phrases here that seem Orientalist to us? For example, how does Daniel argue the peoples of Asia see themselves in relation to other nations?
They see themselves like subservient, like up against, not up against, like one, not less than. I don't know how to say it without saying it.
Oh, okay, so I think that I get kind of like what, and I think that what you're actually interpreting there is how Daniel is suggesting they are now, compared to, it's how Daniel sees them compared to the nations of Europe, right? in what a scholar of post-colonialism would call a subaltern position. Right, so a subaltern in the British military was a kind of junior officer who didn't have their own command. So in post-colonial theory, subaltern comes to be used as a term for a kind of subject people. Right, people who have been conquered and colonized by another nation. So yeah, and I think what you're getting at is how Daniel is perceiving them, not how he thinks they perceive themselves. What does it mean, for example, when he says that they vainly disclaim kindred with other families of mankind? What does it mean to disclaim kindred? Well, I think that would be declaim. So think about what it would mean to claim kindred with other families of mankind, right? What would that mean? What would that mean about the way they see themselves if they claimed kindred with other families of mankind? If you claim kindred with someone, how do you see yourself in relation to them? Yeah, as equals and as related, right? So if you disclaim kindred with another group, what are you saying? Yeah, exactly. So he's suggesting that up until now, the nations of Asia have acted as though they're not like other human beings, right? Have presented themselves as being dissimilar from others, right? Now remember, this is not an Asian writing this, right? This is an Englishman writing about his perceptions of Asian behavior here. And one of the things that he's doing in this paragraph is trying to paint them as essentially alien, right? What other words or ideas stick out here? In terms of like maybe the beginning of an artistic project here. What else does Daniel reveal here about the way he views India and China? Maybe if we look at the last sentence that starts with curiosity has penetrated.
Well, he calls them pompous, and that just seems very negative.
Yeah, he talks of their pompous pretensions to antiquity, right? Almost as though he thinks they're pretending to have this long ancient history that stretches backward, right? Back into, what he calls the veil of mystery, right? So he seems to regard the Asian nations as kind of like having this kind of self-generated mystique, right? That only recently have European travelers been able to penetrate in any way, right? So can we continue here then from, it was an honorable feature in the late century.
It was an honorable feature in the later century, but the passion for discovery, originally kindled by the thirst for gold, was exalted to higher and nobler aims than commercial speculations. Since this new era of civilization, a liberal spirit of curiosity has prompted undertakings to which Irex lent no incentive, and fortune annexed no reward. Associations have been formed, not for piracy, but humanity. Science has had her adventures in philanthropy, her achievements. The The shores of Asia have been invaded by a race of students with no rapacity but for lettered relics. By naturalists whose cruelty stems not to one human inhabitant. By philosophers ambitious only for the extirpation of error and the diffusion of truth. It remains for the artist to claim his part in these guiltless spoliations,
yeah.
and to transport to Europe the picturesque beauties of these favored regions.
Okay, so let's stop here for a second, right? So what kind of activity is Daniel now describing taking place in India? Yeah, it is essentially colonization, right? But how is he painting the process of colonization? What is he saying is not the motive? What are these colonizers not after, according to Daniel? Yeah, they're not there for the money, right? Even though it's the auspices of the East India Company that have opened the road for them, right? But what kinds of colonists do we have coming in here? Like, what sorts of people does he describe coming to India?
Philosophers.
Yeah, we've got philosophers, naturalists, artists, students, right? And I think it's interesting that he uses the phrase guiltless spoliations here. Now, I'm going to suggest that maybe you're not sure what spoliations means. This is not a word that we tend to use very much anymore, right? How many of you are familiar with the phrase, to the victor go the spoils? Okay, what does spoils mean in that context, you know? Yeah, to the victor goes the reward, right? And to spoil, in this context, kind of means to raid and to steal, right? So spoliations are the rewards of theft. Or raiding, right? Piracy. But he calls these guiltless spoliations, right? Because what sorts of things are they taking? And he does describe people taking things, right?
It's in culture and just how they see it.
Okay, yeah. So, you know, kind of, yeah, taking back an image of the culture, right? An image of the region. You know, he does note the shores of Asia have been invaded by a race of students with no rapacity but for lettered relics, right? So it looks like he is describing people actually kind of taking antiquities from India back to Europe, right? This is actually something that's become a big deal in the last 20 years or so, as you know, formerly colonized countries are demanding that museums give back to them things that were taken out of the country without their permission. So yeah, there are like those things being taken, information being taken about the country, taken out of it, right? And artists like the Daniels are taking back images of, you know, the natural and architectural beauty, right? So these guiltless spoliations, I mean, like, how genuinely guiltless do they feel? How far removed from the motives of the East India Company for profit does all of this really seem?
Pretty guiltless because they're not focused on taking material goods.
Yeah, at the very least, like they're not doing any harm on purpose, right? And they're not necessarily focused on the financial exploitation of India. However, it's still kind of what they're doing, right? So what the Daniels are doing is taking a particular picture of India, right, that they can then go back and sell to English consumers to put in their homes and coffee tables, right? The scientists and philosophers are going there to, remove what they describe as error, right? The assumption being that the people of India are intellectually or spiritually inferior and thus need more advanced Europeans to guide them, right? So while Thomas Daniel may not mean any harm in this piece, it's still loaded with Orientalist assumptions, right? Now, I do want to turn to the other poem that I asked you to read, the Letitia Elizabeth Landon poem. And I think I gave you this in the Daniel piece, particularly because these were things that's on page 949. These were things that circulated in gift books and in similar kinds of publications, right? So this was the image of Asia that was being presented to the average middle-class British consumer. So what did you think of the Letitia Elizabeth Landon poem, Immolation of a Hindu Widow? Could you figure out what was going on here? So I think there are some kind of interesting cross currents here with the Sunny poem as well.
She's almost dying in a way. Because at the end it's like a perfect unison, they're more to the heart. Their souls are tied together in eternity or afterlife.
Yeah, and that is exactly what is happening here, right? So what's being depicted here is a practice that was known as Suti or Sati. And this particular practice was the target of British efforts to stamp out what they regarded as barbarous customs, though it's not entirely clear how genuinely widespread this custom actually was. And there were also independent Indian developments, independent Indian organizations that tried to stamp out the same process, right? But the idea here was that a widow would herself be burned alive on her dead husband's funeral pyre. Right, that when your husband died, you went with him. And if we look at the actual action kind of taken in the poem here, right, does it look like the woman in the poem is being prepared for a funeral specifically? What does it look like she's being prepared for? Yeah. And the bride of death phrase appears here again, right? Just like it did in Jagannath. Yeah, she's being decked out. It looks like she's being decked out for a wedding. Good. And what characteristics of the bride here are emphasized?
Flowers in her hair.
She's got flowers in her hair, right? Her raven hair in one rich cluster, right?
The band of gold. Is that not like a wedding ring?
Yeah, a band of gold. The band of gold recalls a wedding ring, right? Good. And do we get the impression that this is an old woman or a young woman?
When I read it, I thought it was a young woman.
Yeah. So, Carl, like upping the air of tragedy there, right? By giving us a young widow rather than an old widow, right? And yet the crowd that gather at her side are pale, and every gazer holds his breath, eyes filled with tears unbidden for the bride of death. She gives away the garland from her hair. She gives the gems that she will wear no more. All the affectations whose love signs they were are gone before. The red pile blazes. Let the bride ascend and lay her head upon her husband's heart. Now in a perfect unison to blend, no more to part. So, before we try to unpack the end of the poem here, I do want to note again the circumstances of its publication, right? So what kind of publication does this first appear in?
A literary annual.
Yes. It first appears in one of those literary annuals like the Mortal Immortal did. And let's remind ourselves of the audience for these literary annuals. Yep, middle-class women. And if you are a middle-class woman in Britain in the 19th century, what is the one thing that society wants you to do? Yes. You need to get married, right? And what does marriage lead to in this poem? Yeah. So on the one hand, you've got the perfect unison to blend, no more to part, right? But in order for that to happen, you have to tie yourself so firmly to your husband that you agree to die when he does, right? So we end up with a poem that is kind of using an exoticized Asian situation, right, to make a comment about Western marriage as something in which women are basically trapped. So again, we kind of have to remember again, the audience perception of this. Kind of the way reading the Mortal Immortal in this way changes our perception of Bertha's behavior, right? Yeah, Jordan, you have a question? Oh, you're just waving his hand up. That's okay. But yeah, so the reason I wanted you to look at this poem in particular is because this is a pretty common trope in late Romantic and Victorian literature, right? And using an Orientalist construct to comment on something in European life. And we are about out of time here, so does anybody have any questions about any of this? Okay, so for next time, we're moving on from Volume D, right? Bring Volume E, the pink one, next time, and we'll talk about Sartor Resartus. And all of this stuff is going to come back shortly after the exam. we will be looking at, where is the damn cursor? Here we go. Can I turn this off again? Yeah.
So on the sample questions you sent out,
Uh-huh.
those just show how the questions will be set up, or will one of those questions be on?
So the questions that are on the exam will have the same kinds of themes, right?
Okay.
But they'll ask you to reference a specific text.
Mm-hmm.
So if you take 2 of those questions that I gave you, and you can answer them with maybe with a couple of different texts, then you should be in good shape.
Okay. Thank you.
Mhm.